And welcome to AAUW's first program of 2023. I'm Deborah Brown, and our speaker is Beth Rose Middleton Manning. Yes, okay. Who is a native Amador girl. There is their information. But the more important part of her biography, she went to elementary school which is not there, I don't know why, in Pine Grove, Pioneer, and Plymouth, junior high at Jackson Junior High, and is a proud graduate of Amador High School. So, go on. After leaving our lovely county, she got her BA in Nature and Culture from UC Davis, and her PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley. And currently she is a professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. And her research centers on Native environmental policy and Native activism for site protection using conservation tools. And she will be talking to you. Just very quickly, I just want to do a little blurb for AAUW, the Association or American Association, thank you. American Association of University Women. It is open to anyone with an AA degree equivalent. And we focus on promoting opportunities, particularly educational opportunities for women in Amador County and around.
Deborah,
Yes.
I brought brochures about AAUW and specifically about our branch. And I will leave them on the table
Yeah.
where I should put them in the first place.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
And if the National AAUW has a policy now that if you join at an event such as this, you get a great reduction on your yearly membership cost.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about it, this would be a good time to join.
yeah.
Oh, and I would also like to thank Nolan McMahon at the back, who is from Amador High Photography Club, and he has volunteered to videotape Beth Rose's presentation, so that many of her classmates who let us know they were not going to be able to be here but wanted to see it. So we thank you, Nolan, for doing that. Oh, and is Helena Laughlin here?
Helen?
I didn't think so.
Helen,
No, Helen is here.
Oh, Helen?
Yeah.
Helen?
Or
Helen?
Carol Rush.
No.
Okay.
All right, that's all for me.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Oops, don't go that way. All right. Thank you very much. And Beth Rose.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming. It's very special to be back home. I already have cried seeing the photos that Brenda brought and seeing friends. So just very grateful to be here. I was born across the street where the old hospital was. So I was already introduced, but I will just share these photos. That's my husband, Danny. He's a firefighter, and he helped me a lot with my Keepers of the Flame fire class that I'll talk about. And then up top are a couple of my students. I have the privilege of working with a lot of students, sometimes students even from Amador County. I just had a student, Anthony Burris, from the Ion Band of Miwok, who finished his PhD and is now a professor at Sac State. I think the first Miwok professor there. So I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. I pulled this from the Amador Arts Council page, which I think they developed with Glenn Villa Jr., acknowledging Nisenan, Washoe, Plains Miwok, Northern Sierra Miwok of Amador County, acknowledging their history and respect of these lands for plants, animals, and native landscapes, contributions to the establishment and sustenance of our towns and communities, uplifting their legacies as they continue to build and sustain culture and practices today and for future generations. I mean, many times land acknowledgements are being adopted now. We have one at UC Davis. There are different ones for different towns, cities. I think they're important to recognize where we are and who's here and the history here. And then there's work to do on top of that. So my topic today is environmental injustice. As you may already know, and mostly I'll give examples, it's just my little definitions piece, but EJ is fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people regardless of race, color, natural origin, or income in respect to environmental law and policy. In rural areas, specifically, there's concern about diffuse sources of pollution that may be difficult to track, and also it can be difficult to understand people's pathways of exposure because maybe we are outside in the environment more, harvesting locally from the environment than people in other places. And then working with Native people, Indigenous environmental justice looks at the impact specifically on tribal members, tribal lands, and takes into account long histories of disruption and removal. Should I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So in particular, the examples I'll give today talk about unequal exposures, some people being exposed more to chemicals than others, culturally specific exposure pathways, particularly working with Native people who may be harvesting plants locally for basketry, running the plants through their mouths as they process them, etc. And then impacts on subsistence, people who are fishing of all ethnicities and eating that fish locally. So environmental injustice are when there are deliberate strategies that impact underrepresented people with contamination or environmental policies that disproportionately affect them. And that can happen also in rural communities where there's diffuse populations, as well as low-income communities and communities of color. And this is not just a random idea. There's a report from 1984 in which an agency paid consultants to define communities that they thought would be least likely to resist a polluting facility because maybe they were less educated or just didn't have a voice in local or regional politics. So there are two main aspects of this. The first question is everybody experiencing the same impacts, distributive justice, and does everybody have the same ability to be at the table and have an impact on decision making? Okay, so Pal EnviroScreen is a tool at the state level to assess where environmental impacts might be highest and communities might be most impacted, but it really leaves out the rural areas. So the dark green are the lowest scores, but there are a lot of contaminants and disproportionate health impacts in these areas, but they're not seen by this tool, which looks at like the density of population, the density of minority populations, and certain types of large polluting facilities. So it leaves out a lot of other impacts. So I'll kind of get back to toxins in a minute, but first I'll talk about one of my main areas of work, which is the water infrastructure in California. So this is a historic map of the State Water Project. We have two, as you probably know, two main water conveyance systems, the SWP and the CVP, the Central Valley Project. So growing up here, I think, and seeing the reservoirs, I was always interested in what were these sort of man-made facilities and where was this water and how we're going and what were some of the impacts. It just kind of, I remember the moment actually in a high school history class when we learned about the Progressive Era, and it just raised all these questions in my mind of how did this start happening. So that's the book, Upstream, which there's a flyer back there and some copies, is really about tracing the history of the development of the State Water Project on the North Fork Feather River. And so this is an old map. A lot of these are from archives. If anyone's been to Lake Almanor, which is up at the top, that is one of the largest facilities at the headwaters of the State Water Project. Oroville Dam is the biggest reservoir on the State Water Project, and that's a little further down. But I was tracing how all this infrastructure was built and what the impacts were on local people. And after I graduated from college, I went to work in Taylorsville for this small nonprofit called Sierra Institute for Community and Environment, which has grown into actually a pretty large nonprofit now, and I serve on the board. And they had office space available for the Maidu Culture and Development Group, which was a local Native nonprofit, which was doing research on what happened to tribal lands that had been recognized at one point in the turn of the century and then taken, canceled, seized, sold in order to develop this water power system. So that's what this book is about. And in fact, the book is just like a slice of the research. Much of it is more about mapping these Indian allotment lands and trying to share that information with community members about what happened to their lands, how they were lost, and trace whether or not they received any restitution. This is an example of one of the tribal land documents, and you can see it's crossed off and it says patented to the Western Power Company. So they lost their lands in many different ways like this. But there was, not a complete happy ending, but a positive element was the Stewardship Council process, the PG&E land investiture. Hi. I think we have a Stewardship Council member here. So this was an opportunity for Maidu people to assert what happened to the history of what happened to their lands, and to be at the table in deciding where those lands would go. This was when PG&E had to put those lands into conservation ownership. I feel like there's been a lot of fluctuation with the process. Many have stayed with PG&E, but many lands have transferred. And one of the parcels that did transfer, one of the larger parcels, went to the Maidu Summit. So I think our collaborative research contributed to this outcome. This is at the ribbon cutting in 2019. Maybe you were there?
Yes.
Yes. So, and there's our Maidu youth and elders cutting the ribbon. So I also have been able to work with the Yurok tribe in northwestern California. Just a quick image of, interesting effect, of where this is. So this is far into the northwest. The Yurok reservation runs 1 mile on either side of the Klamath River from Requa, where it flows into the ocean just past Klamath, up to Wichpec, where the confluence is with the Trinity. Their traditional homeland is much larger than their reservation land base. I really enjoy working with Yurok on environmental health issues. And one of our projects has to do with looking at old infrastructure and how it's impacting community members. So this is a conical burner left over from timber processing, logging on their lands. It's just left there. There's old chemicals. The creek is running right through it. And then right here is an illegal marijuana grow. They have huge problems with this, like massive grows, a lot of trash, unmarked chemicals left. So community members were really concerned. And we developed this partnership in part because I had an advisee who was a Yurok tribal member. So it facilitated our collaboration. And basically we worked together for going on 6 years now to sample the water in the Klamath and tributaries, sample from sediments that are near these old mill infrastructures, and then try to identify what impacts are, what's in the soil, what contaminants, how they might impact living tissues. There's bioassays being done, and then trying to identify together what to do about it. We actually have a meeting on Monday to go over results. But a little context, and I bring this up here because it might pertain to other areas also. Because they don't own a lot of the reservation, even within the reservation boundaries, it's owned by private timber companies. There was a lot of spraying, particularly in the 70s and 80s. All sorts of different pesticides, including atrazine and 2,4-D. And people there, they gather from the forest. They gather basketry materials, they gather medicines, foods, mushrooms, all sorts of different items. And so definitely heavily impacted by the spraying without their consent. They also have issues with biotoxins, blue-green algae, and people being exposed while swimming, while fishing, while in ceremony. And so, our project is just a partial view, but the goal is to think about the impacts of multiple toxins over time on culturally specific lifeways. So these are some images of the Klamath, of a weaver working. This is one of our more exciting results, exciting in terms of being able to share something that's very specific. And in this case, samples from a sediment that was near some old mill infrastructure, an old mill pond. Tadpoles were exposed to an extract, and then they developed differently. So it impacted their development. So this was something that we could share with tribal members so they have this information and can make choices and policy development based on that information. And potentially it could be used to advocate for cleanup of some of these legacy polluted sites. And these are some of the different chemicals one of our grad students in environmental engineering did this analysis, so I can't really speak to what a Spearman correlation is, but these are some of the chemicals that were found. But there are so many unknowns here in terms of how long some of these chemicals last, what impacts they might have intergenerationally, so we can only answer a part of the question in any of our different collaborations. So this is something we're doing right now after we have generally kind of completed what we can do with the sampling right now. Tribal members requested a study they learned about at one of the conferences we went together, where people can wear these silicone wristbands that are passive sampling devices, and then you can analyze these wristbands and see what they're exposed to on a daily basis. So that's in process right now. This is kind of, a picture of what it looks like, passing out the wristband and the information. We're just about to go into our second round. This study asks participants to wear the wristbands in the summer and again in the winter, and we have it distributed by gender and upriver and downriver. But another neat part about this is that the tribe manages the majority of the data, and then we do the analysis. We never know the identity of the participants. So I think it's kind of a neat model for tribal university collaboration. Okay, another thing that I work on that I think is relevant here is beneficial uses of water. So the State Water Board defines these beneficial use categories. What's really interesting about beneficial uses, and here's just an example, just all sorts of uses of water that are recognized, is once a beneficial use is recognized on a particular water body, then water quality standards flow from that. So if, for example, we recognize that we need this particular water for agricultural supply, it has to have a certain standard of cleanliness to be used for that. There were 3 new beneficial uses recognized in 2017, and we'll just go through them. Cultural or tribal traditional and cultural use. So it's really important that this be recognized because this might involve ingesting water. It definitely involves being immersed in water. There are lots of different types of exposures that are currently not addressed, so the water quality standard doesn't protect people with a cultural exposure. Subsistence fishing, so recognizing maybe a higher level of harvest of fish for eating from our local water bodies. And this also goes for non-native people. There's another category for subsistence fishing. However, and that's a picture of traditional Yurok salmon cooking on sticks, but however, these new categories don't apply statewide. They have to be accepted on particular water bodies. So a couple of years ago, I and some others were asked to assist with building the case for the recognition of these beneficial uses on particular water bodies. The project stalled for a number of reasons, but one of the things we did get done was this mapping, and I thought this is probably too small to see, but one of my colleagues in the data center, I think, data lab at Davis made this map, and it shows the streams that are mercury impacted in brown, and this is in this area, shows tribal lands, and it shows mercury-free streams, so streams that aren't listed for mercury because they have a lower concentration, but they may have some mercury. But this was a starting place for us because the subsistence use, it's going to be an uphill battle to try to recognize it on a mercury-impacted stream, so it left these other water bodies as possibilities. And the next step there was then to work with tribal members, interview them about their fish consumption, and then use that as a basis to advocate for getting that beneficial use designated on that water body so that their health can be protected when they eat from that creek. So as we probably know, much of the source of contamination, at least in the foothills and even going down into the valley and all the way to the delta, comes from the gold rush, mercury to extract gold, even also hydraulic mining and the erosion and sediment loading it caused. So we are kind of at, I think, ground zero for the history of some of this contamination and impacts downstream. This is something that I'm interested in that I haven't gotten a chance to work much on, and that's abandoned mines. So where I grew up here outside of Pioneer and then in Amador City, I mean, there are a lot of abandoned mines. In fact, some will be appalled, but a couple high school friends and I we would lower one guy in the mine. Super dangerous. I'd be really upset if my son ever did anything like that. Terrible. But we did that. We explored these mines. So I've often wondered about their impacts and the chemicals that are left behind. This is I think this is from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, their abandoned mine program. There's thousands of abandoned mines, many right in this area. And there are a variety of risks from what flows out of those mines. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here with the last segment. So I get to work with tribal members, which is really a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. Sometimes challenging, but always wonderful. And one thing that we focus on, and that's really difficult for people, is the way their relatives, plant and animal species, are affected by contamination and also affected by their inability to be able to care for them, to steward the plants in particular. So I've been able to learn about and participate in initiatives to reintroduce cultural fire to support the healthy growth of native species. So traditional burning was suppressed by early California law and policy, which has continued into the present, but there are recently a lot of policies that are more open to recognizing tribal-led cultural stewardship. And this is a picture of a workshop with North Fork Mono tribal elder Ron Good. So my class and I have been able to go work with him and learn about cultural fire since 2018. We're about to go in February to meet with him again near Mariposa. And this is his nephew putting in a burn. So cultural burning refers to very site-specific, low intensity. Could be one particular plant, it could be a group of plants, it could be a whole landscape. It depends on the landscape, the timing, the species, the cultural values and perspectives of the group doing the work. There's an emphasis on an ethic of relationality and care, returning to that place and caring for it. Bill Tripp, who is Karuk and a leader in promoting cultural fire, has talked about tribal fire as a form of human services to benefit ecosystems rather than a concept of ecosystem services. Again, it can be really varied, but these are some impacts: reducing pests in traditional foods like acorn, for example, stimulating the regeneration of native plants that need low-intensity fire to grow, reducing invasive species, reducing catastrophic fire danger, creating habitat, improving plants for basketry, etc. There's increasing recognition of cultural burning. This is just a list of a whole bunch of articles recently about cultural burning. But my students and I have developed this amazing class called Keepers of the Flame. It's only possible with our collaborations with community members and diverse students on campus, but we do both a field course for our students and then public workshops around cultural fire. It's very much about hands-on learning, recognizing the knowledge of the elders and the community members that take the time to work with us. And students walk away learning about the ecological importance of fire and just a really different view of fire, from something that's very scary to something that can be worked with, that is a tool, even as a relative. So these are some images of working with Chairman Good, and he led our students and has continued to in burning sourberry and redbud, other culturally important plants. Students and I, we cut back the plants first and then pile them on in a particular way. I was, the first time I was there, I was a little worried because there was all this surrounding brush, but the fire burned exactly as he predicted it would, literally in a little circle there, and the smoke is explained as being like cleansing also for the oaks and other plants around. And then there's a method of mixing the ash into the soil for like the maximum fertility of the soil. And then being able to come back with the weavers when they gather the improved materials after burning is really a positive experience. In addition to burning, our students participate in restoration work. So this is one of our students, Ellen. She's in the green vest. She's a California tribal member also. And when she came to Davis, she discovered her passion through the course of an internship that I've supported in terms of being able to cultivate plants from seed, and then worked with various tribes to gather seed from culturally important plants that were in decline, then grew them out in the Arboretum, and then we did these community planting days, which were really positive. Okay, so to conclude, rural environmental justice, non-point source pollution, so you don't know where exactly the pollution might be coming from diffuse impacts over time, typically from mining and logging, spraying, etc. Legacy pollution that's been there a long time. Lack of pathways for inclusion for people to participate in decision making. Labor and safety issues, criminalization of traditional land stewardship, including fire, and then illegal pollution. And I also want to mention around this exclusion, it can also have to do with exclusion from being able to implement forest management. So being able to go out and do the thinning that's necessary to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire, because it can be hard to impact these public policy processes, is an element of that exclusion. So there's lots of work to do in this field. I think I'll never get tired of it. Identifying pollutions, impacts, the historic and cultural context, contributing to effective policy, and supporting impacted communities. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. So the study you're doing with the wristbands and the pollution tracking, is that something that is, clearly your study is in a very particular area. Is that a method that's used elsewhere as well?
Yes, we learned about it from a group of researchers at Oregon State who have been doing wristband studies with Swinomish tribe. And actually, some of our staff and the Yurok tribe staff went to a conference together and heard a presentation, and then Yurok tribal staff requested that this be brought in their community. So apparently it's pretty expensive to analyze the wristbands, but we have a lab, Tom Young's lab, that can do that. So we had to get funding to support that. Yeah.
Could you repeat it? Repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Was the cultural burning on the news?
Yeah.
Yes, it has gotten coverage, but there's so many different cultural burning initiatives happening now. The Keepers of the Flame work at Davis, the Karuk tribe has a really well-known cultural fire program. There's a few all over the state.
Who in the Newsom administration, whose ear do you have there?
That's a good question. I don't know. I feel like, in a way I'm kind of, just doing our projects, the research and writing. I'm not sure. Do you know who this here we have? Yes.
I was going to suggest, I believe the last name is Davis, Debbie Davis, who works with Office of Planning Research, tribal member, active in water and water quality.
Yeah, I know her. I haven't talked to her for a long time.
You also have the former executive director of the Mining Consortium, who now works for the California Public Utilities Commission as a representative for Native American tribes. You've got Larry Myers, who sits on the Stewardship Council with me, that I've worked with for many years. And he is appointed specifically to represent Native American issues on the Stewardship Council. So you do have representation in the state. It just may not be absolute direct to the governor's office, but it's there.
That's good, if they're listening. Oh, what is?
Are you? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
You go first.
I was going to ask, most of these, many of these projects that you talked about seem to be north of us. Is anything happening in this kind of three-county area with the Miwok tribes currently?
I appreciate that. I have been working with Maidu for a long time and Yurok, and now more working with Wintun. I work with some native land trusts in Southern California, a lot of land back and land stewardship work. reinvigorating wildlife habitat. But I don't know so much about right here. I need to reconnect with Hunger.
Should we comment on that? I've worked with a lot of tribal entities, mainly in Northern California. Unfortunately, we find the local Miwok to be very scattered, and they can't come together to get into any of these kinds of programs. I really wish that were different. And I'm starting to see a little bit of progress in that direction, but there needs to be a lot more. And we need people from the Native community who can advocate for exactly that among the local tribal elders and leaders.
I might say I do see a lot of leadership in cultural resources protection.
Yes.
Ione Band, in particular Buena Vista. I just don't know enough about the work in Jackson. But there's also a lot of cultural leadership here. I think, that maybe this has to do with chasse and ceremonial activities that happen.
Yes.
And actually, one of our partners on the water board is Miwok, Randy Yonamura. I enjoy working with him, from the California Indian Water Commission. And United Auburn Indian Community, just to the north, they have a big fire program that I think is growing into cultural fire. One of our former students works for them now.
Well, the rebuilding of Chelsea was actually a collaborative effort between the various bands locally. And I had great hopes that better things would come out of that, but it doesn't seem to have happened. Hopefully I'm wrong. But I'd love to see these folks get together and do some of the things that I've seen other tribes do, the Yurok, the Maidu, several of them.
I wanted to find out, and actually I'll probably get in touch with you. Have you been working with any of the folks that are looking at pollution impacts on wildlife? So I work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I have a friend who is at Davis and is looking at kind of pollution impacts. And there are potential internship funding and things that I think I will talk to you about, because I think there may be some places where similar information can inform human health and then wildlife health, and we might be able to collaborate on funding for some of this.
That'd be great for some of our students.
And I was excited when I heard you talk about some of that, because I'm like, I think she's working with some of those same labs, so I'll put you in touch.
Great, thank you.
I was just gonna say, just in answering Bob's question about the involvement in local initiatives and regional initiatives, recently there was litigation filed on the federal level by tribal groups and Restore the Delta and some of the other water advocacy groups having to do with the treatment of the waters coming into the Delta. And I am friends with the woman who runs Restore the Delta, so I got a hold of her to say, have you talked to Buena Vista and have you talked to Ione? And apparently the lead for the meals in this area and that effort is the Shingle Springs Rancheria. So they're getting more engaged in the water issues in the area.
I heard about Shingle Springs being involved with that. Shingle Springs Fire Crew came out to one of our burns in November. It was really nice. It's an intertribal gathering.
I don't see it up there, but when we're talking about a lot of environmental justice and like climate change is this huge umbrella that things fall under. And I'm wondering where that comes in, especially when we look at years of drought, unprecedented catastrophic structure loss, that will increase, water contamination. And I'm wondering, is that just still out there and not reachable yet, or are you guys looking at, what's going on there?
Yeah, I took out my climate change slides.
Oh.
It was just too much stuff. But usually when I start talking about fire, we talk about climate change.
Yeah.
And fire suppression over time, and the combination of fire suppression and then increasing aridity, longer the longer dry seasons, hotter temperatures, and how it's like the perfect storm for fire. And then actually a lot of the support for some of the cultural burning work is from the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, thinking about cultural fire as a mode of climate adaptation. If you bring back, reintroduce traditional burning, including the landscape resilience, reducing the drawdown on the water table when it's already limited, thinking about it as mitigating some of those impacts. Yeah, we have another really interesting project with a group of Indian allottees, so individual trust land holders, and a collaborator at the Information Center for the Environment at Davis, and he is doing these climate projections, these models for those lands, downscale to those lands. And then we are having these conversations with elders, and they are talking about what the changes they're seeing. And then we're bringing that together with the climate modeling data, and then thinking about, okay, what do we do to increase the resilience of these very culturally important landscapes? Some of that is cultural fire, increasing sites of climate refugia, like places that are slightly upland or maybe have some underground water available, that those might be sites where plants might still survive, even in the cases of the worst projections.
We usually hear about environmental justice in industrial areas where so many minorities are impacted by that. As far as getting funding for your work, does more of the money go in that area than in rural?
Definitely, and I feel like it should. Like there are very significant EJ issues and polluting facilities and concentrated communities that are highly impacted. So I'm aware of that, but at the same time, I feel like there are these rural issues that don't get discussed, and there are people suffering. I mean, many of the people I have worked with have had different illnesses, and they think it relates back to this spraying or this contamination that was never recognized, or the fact that they're drinking the local water not being recognized. And I guess I personally am interested in it because we drank water from the spring when I was growing up, and it was just over the hill from the mill. And it's just, I think it's interesting and important. But I don't want to take away from where there are these egregious issues with concentrated populations.
I wonder, I think it was 93, Stanford did a study and decided, and the result of the study was for what would be the long-term sustainable population for the planet. And they came up with about 1 billion people and said that it's way overpopulated beyond that. And so the longer you go with heavier load on it, the more the long-term sustainable population will be degraded below 1 billion. What's your view on that? That impacts everything else.
Yeah, I feel like that's a tough question. There's a question in there about our resource use and resource management and efficiency versus cost. I mean, one of the things I learned studying these water systems is, just from my perspective and going through the archives, there were decisions made that seemed like they were made more to enrich people than they were for ecology or efficiency. So I think that's a big question. Maybe if we were approaching things differently, there's more carrying capacity. I don't know. I find those questions difficult because I don't want anybody to go.
Local, like school things in this person, or burns in school.
Yeah. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I can repeat the question, sorry. So where do the burns take place? Do they happen locally? Are there education opportunities locally on the burns? I would kind of like to develop that. I've been thinking about it in the back of my mind. Right now, we work at the Tending and Gathering Garden at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve, which is a nonprofit. We'll be out there tomorrow outside of Woodland. We also work with Chairman Good on his private land in Mariposa. A lot of work takes place on private land. Tribal fire crews come and help us, and CAL FIRE. Len Nielsen has been a great ally with the Prescribed Fire program. I am advocating for being able to do some of this work on UC lands. like our natural reserves and extension land bases, but there's just a lot of layers of bureaucracy. It's been easier on private land. So,
Are you allowed to, are we allowed to join and learn from you guys, or is it, you know, how do you involve?
yeah, there are public workshops that reach out. There's also increasingly tracks trainings, prescribed fire training exchange. I know Yurok and Peru do one. They end up being very popular. There's one in Lake County that's happening. Also, another one of our staff, UC Extension, Lenya Quinn Davidson, she leads a lot of fire education, building prescribed burn associations. So it's growing. I think there's like increased flexibility with being able to try to burn on your land. There's some new laws that passed that reduce liability, but it's still very difficult because there's a lot of fear of fire. I think there's a good reason, and there's a lot of work on the landscape that often has to happen before you can burn. So cutting, removal, breaking, I mean, just, you gotta do a lot of prep because there's so much fuel and it hasn't burned in so long. But the science shows that it burned very regularly in the past until fire suppression began in the late 1800s. So trying to figure out how to get back to that process.
I'm wondering what some of the differences are between state and federal control burn and cultural burn.
That's a great question. So the differences between prescribed fire and cultural fire. So we've been looking at this. Sometimes cultural fire can be on a big scale like prescribed fire, but key differences are like the ethic, the approach, the purpose of burning. Cultural fire, I would say, is a lot more nuanced and linked to people's relationship to the place. Like the burning we do here with Ron, it's really for the weavers, you know, and our group is always like, we want to monitor and count how many stones come back and stuff. And he's like, well, the benefit is when you see the weavers leave with this good material and they're, you know, happy with what they've collected, and they can make baby baskets and all different kinds of baskets that maintain that cultural practice and knowledge. So it's really tied to the community and the outcome in the community and intergenerational learning and keeping those relationships alive. Whereas prescribed fire, I think, is much more of a land management tool without that sort of relationship. I think you need both in these times when you really do need to bring back fire. But it's exciting to see the number of people who are doing the cultural burning again now. Was there a question here?
Have you got any results from the studies of the wristbands as far as the toxic chemicals accumulating in the?
Not yet. So we did the first round in September, and those are at the lab, and the next round goes out January 31st, I think. So the lab is going to analyze them all at once. But I can share, there's like a couple papers from OSU study with what they found with Swinomish. And they are near a polluting facility, so there was evidence of that in the wristbands.
What was the polluting facility in Oregon?
Gosh, I can't remember.
About the number now?
I think it's in Washington, actually. The university is in Oregon, but the tribe is in Washington. So the question is, what was the polluting facility? I just can't remember right now. But it's some big sort of factory that, it's an industrial facility, and it's right by the reservation.
Washington, I see a paper mill.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm prejudicing this that it's Amador County centric. And given the many waterways and rivers and creeks that we have here and the history of mining and logging, if you were given a blank check and a blank sheet, what would your project be? And from being here, what would you like to be seeing down here? I mean, how can any of us make an impact? What can we do?
I think my question would be, first, where does the local water come from? So when you turn on your tap in Amador County, what water body is it coming from? And then I would want to test that water. And also I would like to understand what the beneficial uses are designated on that water body, and therefore what's protected and what's not. And I probably want to talk to tribal members or people who might be living off the land a little bit more than others, fishing and hunting, to find out a little bit about how much These are tricky questions. Sometimes people don't really want to share, they don't know why you're asking. It really takes relationship building, and showing that this is about protecting their health, that they share this information. So that's what I would want to know, where could we have the most impact? And then maybe second layer would be sites that were former industrial sites, maybe some of the mill sites, maybe some of the mine sites, doing some sampling there to get a sense of what contaminants are still present and how they might impact people, just to let people know how you might be safest in these areas. And then next level thinning, like I see a lot of need for forest thinning. Yes?
Can you give us to our own testing, like for me, with what recent flooding and all that water came down to the tailings? Is there any way that we can test that water?
You know, I don't know enough about that. One of our goals with this study was to create these little test strips that people could use at home. But the challenge we faced was that there were a variety of chemicals at a low level. And our collaborators who were designing those test strips were designing them for particular chemicals. So there was not like one chemical for people to test for. So that was our challenge. I know that if you have a private well, it's on you to do the testing. That's been, I had a student working in environmental justice who was sampling wells in the Central Valley and then having to give people these reports that were showing they were like 200 to 400 times the allowable standard of different types of contaminants. That's very, very difficult. But I'm sorry, I don't know enough about local being able to test on your own.
I mean, like we have a spring in the back of our house, and we know for some of the there's arsenic and cyanide. Well, all the rains go through the spring, our property. We already have 2 people in our neighborhood with cancer. So you kind of go, what's in the spring, what's in that water?
Yeah.
So we would know if the agency that would help us do that.
I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. That's,
Could you?
Yeah, it is a huge question. I think about that a lot. Because we never even thought to test when I was growing up.
No, it wasn't, yeah, you're right. We don't feel that sick.
Yeah, I think that there was more testing available in the past when there was an actual lab in the county. And there's not one now. There is an ongoing groundwater study in the American Cosumnes and McCulmy basins being done through Sac State and the USGS, where if you were lucky enough to get in it, which I was because I learned about it early enough, they will come and do extensive testing on your well once every 5 years. And they give you, incredibly thorough results. It takes about 6 months to get you get immediate field results, and then you get the lab results about 6 months later, and the nuclear isotope results, which tell you the age of the water, months after that. But the results of it's called the Gamma Project, and if all that data is online, so you could see at least in your area, what the water quality looks like if there's a sample well in your area, because they're all shown in maps. But that wouldn't guarantee you that your water is that same water, because most of the groundwater wells in Amarillo County that are east of Highway 49 are in fractured rock, and they could be in a really small pocket of rock, or a water body that's expensive, and there's no way to really know that without the kind of extensive testing that everybody does on a landscape well.
I think via State Water Resources Control Board, I remember navigating some websites that do provide data on water quality on particular water bodies. But I would, hopefully I can get your email and I can go back and have it.
Well, in Ireland, we already have our already water contaminated the source, which is called Buell State Prison. And for some mysterious reason, the state just can't seem to.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Well, it was more of a comment about the contamination in Ione from Mule Creek State Prison and lack of state action.
So is there any way to generate that we haven't done?
Well, it could be partnering. Sometimes, one of the challenges I think we face, or I think about a lot working at the university, is that we do have all these amazing labs that can do these studies. but it seems like we only get to work with a certain number of communities and funding's always limited. I'm always trying to think of ways that our students can be involved in supporting this testing and giving the results to community members so that they can then advocate for cleanup.
Well, we advocate. That's not the problem. We advocate, we just don't have everything done.
I think it's very frustrating with different agencies, and sometimes you're working with so many agencies. State Water Resources Control Board, Board of Substances Control, DTSC, EPA. It's really difficult.
You have a day where you can sign up to be notified of things you guys do or to get involved in?
It's good, maybe. Yes, you can share your email, and one of my students has started a listserv of the folks who've been part of the class or the workshop to share information.
Or get involved?
Yeah. People, yes, I feel like there's not a central clearinghouse of information because there's lots of things going on. The fire safe councils seem to be a locus of work in different communities, and sometimes they have partnerships with tribes also. I know in Chico, their fire safe council is really active.
We have them here. Yes.
I was just going to say, in this region, in Amador and Calaveras County and Alpine counties, there's a collaborative group called the Amador Calaveras Consensus Group. And they've had tribal reps involved since they were formed, and it's now maybe 14 years old. And they work primarily on national forest lands, but also on private lands, and their private landowners are involved. And they have just recently adopted a tribal ecological knowledge policy. So they're, an entity that is trying to tune into this more than they have in the past and work on it more. But so they have a website so people can find out what they're doing on their website.
It would be great to connect with them.
Do you have a website? Thank you.
I do have a UC Davis website. I don't update it.
Yeah. So you don't have something that shows like what you're working on or?
Yeah, no, not so much, I'm sorry. I did bring my books, and all of the proceeds go to, or well, all the royalties go to tribal organizations that were associated with the books. But I just brought 6 copies of the Upstream book, and I didn't bring any copies of Trust in the Land, but there are some flyers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.